And this has been a really tough last couple of weeks, I have to say. There's been a lot of news about the Jews in in the internet and public discourse, and not always in a positive way. In fact, I noted that yesterday the phrase "the Jews" was actually the top trending item on Twitter, and that just can't be a good thing. And unfortunately, we live in a time right now, I mean, right now, like today, where these issues are of exaggerated importance and often in a very deleterious manner. Many of us have been concerned by the apparent rise of the Hebrew Israelite movement, which is a movement that has connections to Judaism, although at the same time also to Christianity. And normally, this would not present any kind of challenge to the Jewish community. They are not the first, and I certainly think they are not the last group of people who believe that they are of Jewish extraction. And there may, in fact, be some merit to that. That's going to be something we'll discuss in greater detail, God willing, next week. But what's frightening about this is that there's an unusual militancy among some of those groups. For example, this is from a protest that occurred just last week here in New York State, actually in the holy city of Brooklyn. And these are some of the flyers that were distributed. And you can see that the argument that many Hebrew Israelite groups maintain, not all, I shouldn't say even many, I should say some, they argue that they are, in fact, the quote unquote real Jews, and the other people who call themselves Jews, which basically means Ashkenazic Jews, are in fact imposters. And more than that, there is a kind of like an evil motive behind these imposters who have striven to displace the true Jews. And there's just a lot of nonsense going on with that. I myself can tell you that I've been an Ashkenazi Jew all my life, and I've never had any attempt to displace anybody else from their Jewish identity. As far as I'm concerned, they're perfectly welcome to believe whatever they want. It doesn't really bother me. I hope they don't impinge on my beliefs about my identity. And as you can see from this flyer, there's also, strange admixtures of Christian elements as well. Many of these Israelite movements, they prefer generally the term Israelite to Jew, borrow heavily from Christianity or lean Christian in their beliefs as well. And they tend to draw from some of the nastier elements of Christianity, like this passage from Revelation 2.9, referring to the synagogue of Satan. It's not a joke, because some of the more extreme, deranged people who associate with these movements have been associated also with terrible violence, including an awful shooting in Jersey City, some violence in upstate New York as well. Beyond the violence, we should note that there are many Israelite congregations that have very good relationship with other Jewish movements, even if there's still disagreement about who is Jewish and who is not. And a lot of this wrangling over who gets to use the term Jew to describe themselves has caused chaos among the various Black Israelite movements as well. Everybody seems to want to argue what color Jews were originally. Let's try and figure out that question. What does the historical data suggest? We have no clear-cut answer from biblical texts or archaeological texts, but we do have some scientific data, and we do have some very suggestive data from both biblical texts and archaeological data. Let's start with biblical passages, for example. According to the book of Genesis, the roots of the Jewish people are in southern Iraq, very close to Kuwait. Abraham and his wife Sarah originate from the city of Ur, and that puts us down, right in the Persian Gulf region like that. Later on, several other family members who may already have come from Ur are married in from the region of Padan Aram, which would be in Syria. Now, even if one does not want to take the biblical passages at face value, one has to recognize that when they were circulating in antiquity, if they were way out of whack with people's sensibility, people would say, hey, wait a second, how can it say we come from Ur because we physically look so different than all those Ur people? And we don't have evidence of any of that objection. Secondly, if we assume, and it's not necessarily an assumption we have to make, but if we assume that the people who live there today basically look like the people who lived there in antiquity, then we should be able to get a sense of what did Abraham and Sarah actually look like. So this is what typical Iraqis look like today. And you can see that they tend to have a little bit darker complexion. They tend to lean towards darker hair color, although the child on the right seems to have a little bit lighter hair color. In terms of biblical texts, there are a few kind of interesting passages that refer to possibly darker skin in the sense that they were at some level understood to be other, but at the same time, they're also part of the community as well. Moses, for example, in Numbers 12, there's a whole discussion of the fact that he married a woman from Cush, Cush being the ancient term for Ethiopia. So on the one hand, the fact that she's identified differently, either by her place of geographic origin or possibly by her skin color, because Cushite could easily mean an Ethiopian colored woman as opposed to an Ethiopian origin woman. But at the same time, she's Moses's wife. I mean, you can't get much more into Jewish royalty than marrying Moses. So even though she is identified as somewhat other, she is also intrinsically the same. And you also have this passage in Song of Songs, which is a highly allegorical representation of the communication between God and the Jewish people. That's how it's understood in the rabbinic tradition. And this passage here, the figure representing the Jewish people says, Shechora ani v'na'ava, which is translated, I am black, but comely, or but beautiful. That vav, na'ava, and comely, or but comely, could be translated as an and or a but the context here implies that it is a but, meaning I am different, I am black, but nevertheless I am beautiful. And most importantly, this is a metaphor referring to the entire Jewish people. So it's hard to be any more inside than that, despite the difference in skin color. So that's to summarize what we know from the data about Jewish skin color based on some common sense, some current ethnographic data, some biblical texts, and what limited archaeological evidence we have. So the next big question is, okay, how did Ashkenazim specifically become white eligible? And I want to emphasize here this point that you could simply say become white, but that's not at all accurate, because whiteness is, as social scientists have demonstrated in so many ways, a social construct, and people are accepted or not accepted as white, which means essentially being within the higher status of society, based on a whole host of factors, of which complexion is only one of them. And quite often there is kind of like a spectrum of skin colors that can still, as they say, pass. For Jews, whiteness was really not extended to them as a people. When I say Jews, I mean Ashkenazic Jews here in America, really until the 1940s. Let's get to the more simple question. Okay, we know a little bit about how Jews became white eligible and how they were considered white in American society in particular, but how did they get this specific skin tone? I mean, how did you take a picture and it looks sort of like this? An article, scientific article, it's preprint, it's going to be appearing in a very prestigious scientific journal, that is based on a study of graves that were uncovered in Erfurt, Germany. Here is a photograph of the site where the graves were uncovered, just outside the old city wall. You can see in the top picture, there's a big kind of like granary there, and on the right, there's the old city wall. And immediately below the granary, they found these graves. The article is by S. Waldman et al. There's about 30 people listed as authors, and it's genome-wide data from medieval German Jews show that the Ashkenazi founder event predated the 14th century. I'm going to unpack this very important title for you. But basically what they did was, here is a rare moment where you have an opportunity to study the DNA of individuals at a specific moment in time, and look at the unfolding of the genetic history of a people. Basically, they were able to date the founder event. I'll explain what that means. And it has huge implications for our question of Jews and color. So have a look at this diagram here, which shows a genetic bottleneck. The bottom end is earlier in time, and the top end is contemporary period. So here at the bottom, you've got Jews in ancient Israel, right? Jews living in the land of Israel for millennia. And then they have and at the very top, this is modern Ashkenazi Jews. Me, and I assume a lot of people on this call. In the ancient period, you've got lots of people mixing in with the small original Jewish community that's associated with Abraham. You have people like the Bible refers to Ruth, who comes from the land of Moab, and other historical sources have people like Antipater, who came from Idumea. You have Helena of Adiambene. These are just like famous, well-known people, but obviously there are thousands of just neighboring peoples who end up marrying in this small group that trace their lineage back to the Exodus and beyond. So they're living in the land of Israel, slowly incorporating other peoples in their genetic stock. And then you have two disastrous wars with Rome. The Great War of 66 through 74, which resulted in the destruction of the temple, and a massive number of Jewish slaves shipped off to Rome. Josephus, who was our primary source for this period, he often exaggerates numbers, but many historians think he's probably pretty accurate in this period. He writes about 97,000 Jews being shipped off into slavery. And then 60 years later, you have another revolt, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And in 135, the land is once again denuded of people, particularly in Judea itself, and Jews are shipped off to Rome for the slave markets, or also in Asia Minor and other places. So you've got now a big population of Jews living in Rome. And by the way, there was a population of Jews living in Rome that predated the war. There's references to it in a lot of the rabbinic literature that goes back well into the 1st century before the Common Era, even some scattered references for the 2nd century before the Common Era, when Judah Maccabee first